Hello friends, welcome to the last week of our course on poetry. This is your panel discussion on teaching of poetry. We have two guests, one Dr. V. Meena Kumari, Associate Professor, Department of English, Anna Adesh College for Women, Anna Nagar, Chennai. We have another guest, Dr. G. Kalvikarasi, Associate Professor, Department of English, DRBCCC, Hindu College, Chennai. Both of them have extensive experience of teaching English and poetry for nearly 3 decades. They have their research experience. Dr. Meena Kumari has done her PhD on Henry David Thoreau, and Dr. G. Kalvikarasi has her PhD on comparative literature, specifically on the dialectics of love, imagery in British metaphysical poetry and Tamil Sangam poetry. I am pleased to welcome both of them to our program now. Let's have our discussion. We have some questions on the teaching of poetry. We will raise them one after another. They will give their opinions, and then finally we will summarize our discussion. Welcome ma'am once again. Welcome ma'am once again. We have been teaching poetry for the past several years. Shall we share our experience of what poetry is to begin with? Please ma'am.
So, like, you want me to define poetry?
Yes, define,
Okay,
describe,
yeah.
give us
See,
your opinion.
Poetry is a beautiful form of literature. At the same time, it's a very important form of literature. And when I want to define what is poetry, I just don't want to define like Wordsworth. I feel my own definition is that a piece of writing which evokes an emotional response in a reader. Something that ignites a spark when you read a poem. So I would like to put poetry in this way, as a piece of writing which evokes strong emotional response when we read.
That's great. Poetry is evocative.
Yeah.
That's what you mean.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Your opinion, please.
Yes. So poetry is actually a vast genre which really defies definition in a nutshell. But my attempt to define poetry would be that poetry is a living experience in itself. And either it presents the living experiences, or as Madam said, it evokes the emotional responses in the imaginative language through sound, rhythm and images, and also added to it the ideas which forms the major part of poetry. So I would say that poetry actually transcends all the boundaries and aspiring to have the universal brotherhood, and that is how I look at poetry.
Thank you, ma'am. So here we have universal experience, and ma'am has this evocative experience. In all, we respond to poetry from our heart, from our mind, and we feel happy about reading poetry. That's good. Now, our next question is relating to why we like teaching poetry. We have so many other subjects, prose, drama, novel, but there is some kind of special liking for poetry. What could be the reason for your liking of poetry, ma'am?
I do teach prose also, but why I prefer teaching poetry is that, as I told you, it evokes the emotional response in a person. And moreover, poetry is something like a form of a string of words, and each word has got an image.
Yes.
For example, when a teacher reads, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. The moment I say beauty, one sort of an image comes to my mind. When I say beauty, some other image might come to you, and some other image might come to her. So poetry gives an opportunity for us to interpret it in so many ways, and that draws countless meanings. If you take W.B. Yeats among school children, how can we know the dancer from the dance? When a teacher reads in South India, the students might think of Bharatanatyam. In Kerala, it might be Kathakali. For you, it might be Mohiniyattam. Suppose an African classroom, the teacher is going to read, it must be an African dance. So we can just transfer us, because what is so sweet about poetry is that, sir, the fluidity in poetry. It doesn't conform to certain rules. Whereas prose also can evoke your feelings, but it conforms to certain rules. Okay, there is no fluidity as that of poetry, and the feelings which a poem evokes is much more and much more stronger when compared to prose.
That's beautifully done. Thank you, ma'am. What about you, ma'am?
It's, I just would like to quote Robert Graves in a interview to Horizon, says that being a poet is not a profession, but it is a condition. So, likewise, I feel personally that teaching poetry is a very natural way of speaking, or the natural response I would rather give, and I enjoy teaching poetry. And more than that, I feel that poetry gives a sense of humanity. So, where I would like to quote few lines where we could see that when Matthew Arnold goes on with his Dover Beach, where he tries to explain about the Victorian morality that had been in depletion. So, he makes a transition, taking the macrocosmic world and getting on to the microcosmic world. So, he beautifully starts the poem saying that the sea is calm tonight. And then he makes a transition there. The sea of faith was once too full, and he expresses his anguish. And later we find that he concludes the poem saying that we are swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight. And so, not only that we are able to understand humanity at that period, we also find that poetry is so very multidimensional that it also tries to give the picture of history, culture, and also about the society across centuries. So, we find another quote which I would like to share with you is Pablo Neruda himself coming up with that. And you will ask, why does not his poetry speak of dreams and leaves and the great volcanoes of his native land? And he just gives the answer in a nutshell. Come and see the blood in the streets. So, this way poetry could bring in politics and the real state of affairs that exist. And so, it becomes so very multidimensional that just it doesn't stop with emotional responses to love or something, but it tries to express the religious values, the cultural values of the society. And more than that, I also find that it brings in the cathartic effect too. So, though we start the poem of Wordsworth, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. And nobody could really forget it, and the evergreen poem that though it starts with a slight melancholic note, after that we find that it brings in fresh air to us.
Yes.
And we are able to see the panoramic view of it. And when poetry could give us so much delight and so much knowledge about things, I feel that it is, I am very proud to say that it is my occasion that I am able to teach poetry and share my thoughts too.
That's wonderful, ma'am. So each one has a reason for teaching poetry. One has interpretative freedom. Professor Meena Kumari has that kind of fluid experience. So we can call it interpretative freedom or experiential freedom that she has. And here Dr. Kalvi Karasi says she is really absolutely delighted in teaching poetry, as it is the condition of human beings, universal condition of human beings. That's fine. Now, let's come to this major crux of our panel discussion today, teaching of poetry. What are the ways in which you teach poetry, ma'am? And is there any special ways that you have?
I feel very strongly anybody who teaches poetry must teach with what is, to begin with, what is known as rendition of a poem.
Yes.
That plays a very important role. Yes. As you render a poem, the student is listening. The way you're rendering a poem, the student should be able to understand and visualize what exactly the poet is trying to communicate. Okay. So I strongly believe in rendition of poems. So first I always render the poem to classroom, and then I ask them to render. are they able to keep pace with what the tone in which I rendered?
Good.
And then ask them what did exactly you understand, your interpretation. And then there I stop, then I'll go back to the poet and place him in which circumstance he wrote, which age he wrote.
Okay.
That is very, very important. And then after placing him, the poet, I just try to have a circumference of the poem. I don't go beyond that.
Okay.
Of course, I speak a little bit about the poetic devices, but I don't go beyond that for a student. I just give them the meaning, try to analyze the poem, the theme of the poem. So I believe strongly in rendition of the poem.
Do you like to render your poem, ma'am, now?
Yeah, sure, sir.
Please.
I've just got a couple of poems here. First, I would like to render The Pulley by George Herbert.
Good.
Yeah. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches, which dispersed lie, contract into a span. So strength first made a way, then beauty flowed, then wisdom, honor, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made a stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasure rest in the bottom lay. For if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also on my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me, and rest in nature, not the God of nature. So both should losers be. Yet let him keep the rest, but keeping them with repining restlessness, let him be rich and weary, that at least, if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's how I render the poem. And then, of course, I place the poet in the age and the background. And then, of course, I explain to them word by word, try to analyze the poem, tell them what the theme of the poem.
Okay, ma'am. Now let's go to Professor Kalvi Karasi and listen to her on how she teaches poetry in her class. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir. Actually, when we take up the poetic text, I allow the students to go on reading it aloud for some time, at least twice, and give them some time to meditate on it. And usually, when I look at the dynamics in the classroom, I find that the students become more interested in anatomizing the poem, coming out with the linguistic features of it, which they find it very easy without training. But when it comes to the content of the poem, that is where the real challenge of it lies. And they struggle a bit with the suggestive devices, and I think that the teachers must really get into and facilitate their understanding. And it also becomes very demanding for them because they need to understand the historical background, or rather the cultural or even the cultural background of that age. And apart from that, they also feel that they do not have enough practice with the approaches to poetry. So I think the NPTEL course would really help them to look at the different approaches that had been defined so well by you, sir. And where particularly they are stuck with the semantic approach to it. And or they are able to look at all the poetic devices and do a good work. But when it comes to the semantic part of it, their understanding demands our facilitation more there. And another thing which I find is whether the students had not been adequately trained in sharpening their perspectives, and whether along with the introduction of the literary text, we could also introduce them to the literary theories down the timeline, like starting from Aristotle's Poetics or Dandi's Dandi Alangaram, or coming up with the Rasa theory or Dvani. I think essentially we need to also in parallel present them with the literary theories, which will make them to develop or sharpen their perspectives and enjoy the multidimensional approach they would develop towards poetry. So I do give them lot of theories along with the introduction of the literary text. And the university curriculum also must take into account that along with the social background of that age, we must also help them with the literary theories as such of what the nature of literature is, and what could be the parameters by which they could get on with their interpretation. It is not that we are losing much on their own interpretation. It also serves as the guidelines,
Additional
literary
input.
inputs, where they will be able to fix their position and look at whether the particular poem lends itself to what kind of approach that they could take in specific. Like a poem lends itself to the feminist approach, then they would be able to take that stand where all the metaphors or the suggestive devices becomes very luminous for them.
True.
So it is very important for them to take that position, and which could be guided, I think, by introducing the literary theories also, which I try to do in the classroom. So it is like a sort of a listening comprehension and reading comprehension for them. And so they do a lot of work other than getting on with the other genres like novels or drama. I think students really focus more on poetry and trying to do a lot of work by themselves, and so that way it also improves their communication skills, collaborating with their peers and coming up with their ideas.
Good to hear that from you, ma'am. Students are interested in analyzing poem in depth. That's good. Now let's move on to the next question about questions from students. What are the questions that normally you receive from students on reading poetry?
Yeah, the moment they listen to a poem and then after listening to the interpretation of the poem, they have got like common questions like, what is the mood of the poet when he wrote? And why did he write such a poem? Only for that we need what is known as the background study. So we must speak about the poet, the background of the poem. For example, I was teaching Richard Cory by Edward Arlington Robinson. So they did not understand why there was a person like this. I just like to quote a few lines here. The poem goes this way, sir. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from soul to crown, clean favored and imperially slim. And then the poet talks about how he's such a rich man walking around. And towards the end, the last stanza goes this way. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. So the students are so curious to know why is that he was so rich, okay? And then why did he put a bullet? So in that way, the background studies plays a very important role. That time I told them this poem was written during the economic depression. Okay, when the economic growth of the country was going down and majority was in poverty. And very rarely only the rich people were able to manage. And immediately they were able to compare with our present situation, what is happening in this pandemic also. Okay, so we have to talk about the background. So sometimes when we say about the background, they're very happy, and then we discuss about the theme. In a BA class, my teaching stops with only interpretation of a poem, okay, and analysis of a poem. Whereas in a PG class, the interpretation goes a little more apart from analysis. Okay, here they understand the content, they know the theme, they're very happy with the poet, and when he was born, what was the purpose of his writing, the mode of the poet. There ends. Whereas in a PG class, we try to elaborate a little more. We bring in theories. Like when I teach a poem, I'll just ask, do you think this poem has got something to do with, like ma'am said, about literary theory? I speak about Robert Frost, a figure a poem makes. What does he say there? A poem should begin with a delight and ends with wisdom. Does this poem begin with delight and ends with the wisdom? Or I bring about Alan Tate, tension in poetry. He speaks about poetry has got some tension because a little bit of a dramatic effect is there in poem. Do this poem has got a dramatic effect? We discuss such things in the PG classes. Yeah.
What about the kind of questions that you receive from your students?
Yes, sir. Actually, they have problems, as I already stated. The problems are rather the apprehension, whether they are able to understand the essence of the poem. So they come up with a lot of questions on that it all looks very vague, and we want to know more about the background of a poem. And also they find it very difficult to unravel the metaphors
Okay.
where they need additional inputs there. So these are the generally the difficulties they find when I was teaching metaphysical poetry in the class with John Donne's poem. I too could feel the difficulty in them understanding the poem, because the 17th century metaphysical poems were two very different when we look down the ages. And how do they take it unless they understand the scientific temper of the 17th century? They would not be able to even understand the metaphors. So I always tell the students that whenever you find some heterogeneous images or dissonance in that, or the discordant tone in the rendering of the poem, that is where you need to concentrate more and try to understand why the poet is particularly using this image, which had rarely been found in the poems of any other centuries, so that they could by themselves understand what is the background of that age. And it also comes up with different stylistic devices, and they find again it poses challenge for the students, and it is quite enjoyable also for them later, that when we start explaining to them about the 17th century, about the scientific temper of that age, and then they try to look at the poems with a different perspective. So for example, quoting John Donne's very popular comparison of the lovers to the draftsman's compass.
Okay.
And so the students would have been very much startled with the comparisons. And so they go on with the dialectal mode. And one important advantage we had even with the metaphysical poems is they had this dialectical mode. They argue by themselves, I mean in the poem, and the students are able to understand it. So the background of the poem is very important for them even to understand why such a type of metaphor had been used.
Okay.
And also why are they coming, what is the intention of the poem, or rather the intention of the poet might not be making a very true account, but the semblance of it which we could find in the poem. So what ultimately is the purpose of the poem? So that is where they look at it as a kind of a puzzle which they try to do, taking the historical background and taking the metaphors and why the usage is like this. And so it is like the complete anatomy which they perform with the poem.
That's great. Now that actually takes us to the next question of strategies in reading poems. We may learn some strategies from the critics or from other readings. In the course of teaching our own poetry, have you developed or have you come across some kind of new strategy that you think is unique to you that you are using in your classes?
Yeah, like I told you, sir, like I always introduce poetry only by rendition.
Okay.
And that may be a very old way of doing it, but I believe strongly in that. And of course, I try to analyze the poem and interpret the poem and talk about the poetic devices. But of late, what I felt, and I'm using a new strategy through these online classes, that I try to give them some pictures of the
Very
poet.
good, very
Okay, I just show them the picture of the poet, and sometimes I happen to get the picture of the house where he lived in, little bit of his background and what made him write, and then about the poem itself. If there is some video clippings or pictures,
That's wonderful.
I show all that. Okay, and they are so impressed and they remember.
Okay.
Whether they remember me or not, they remember the poet. Okay, it's like that. So they remember. So this online way of teaching helps you to be a better teacher. I strongly believe in that, because when not only the audible of a voice is there, but also the pictures. So they are having an impression on those pictures. So I think that's the only new strategy I'm using as of now.
Very good, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. This makes me to get reminded of one of my classes where I was teaching Herbert's Easter Wings.
Okay.
And the poem, as you all know, had been presented as a visual structure.
Yeah.
So the spread wings along which the poem had been written.
Yes.
And this came as a very new strategy for the students to understand. But I found that many of them were able to compare that with their own native poetry,
Okay.
where they had what we call as kolam or rangoli.
Oh, yes.
And so the dots had been replaced by the letters,
Okay.
and they tried to compose the poetry together. So it is whether the barrack architecture that really influenced the Herbert's poetry, or whether it is going to be the native style of which the students were able to make such seamless comparisons. And sometimes they also identify that this particular poem has more scope for translations.
Oh, I see.
So we allow them to translate, and they try to create a blog, and they try to upload their translations in the blog to get more reviews on that.
Very good.
So that way we also get on with the digital mode, so that the students also have that aspiration of their own publications getting on with the world.
So can we say that the translation is a teaching strategy that
Definitely,
you adopt in
sir.
your classes?
Definitely, sir.
That also, I think, addresses your problem of understanding the poem, semantic problem.
Yes, sir. That's what they go with. Lot of challenges when they translate, but sometimes they themselves come that this would be easier for them to translate, and if it is in their own native tongue, they would be able to enjoy it more. So likewise we do that.
I believe that that kind of translation is also a kind of cross-cultural current between two literatures that happen. That will be very useful for both literatures.
Yes. That is how the students also develop a taste for literature. So.
That's good. Now, there are some poems that we often refer to in our teaching throughout the year, throughout the semester, throughout our career. Do you have such a poem that is close to your heart that you share with your students often, very often, even in your discussions with your friends?
Yeah, I generally share many poems I share, but which comes to mind right now is Road Not Taken by Robert Frost.
Okay.
And then The Pulley. Both the poems I discuss because what I feel right now, the need of the hour, the student, is that some sort of a moral culture must be there. Okay. So I strongly believe in that. So I always talk about Pulley. Okay. God has given everything to you, but He's holding something. That is a peace of mind. And how do you gain that? So I make them think morally by quoting that poem. The other poem I always encourage, even a +2 student or a 10th standard student or a college student, is Road Not Taken. That's because what is happening in our society is that, sir, when a child is just growing up, either you become an engineer or you become a doctor or you enter into IIT, things like that. They are not letting the child grow by itself, developing his or her own passion. Okay. So I always try to tell them about Road Not Taken, and I quote the last two lines quite often. The last two lines, which takes about, take the different road. I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.
Yes.
Okay. So you must try to take, if you do literature, doesn't mean that you must become an English teacher or English professor. If there is some other passion growing alongside, entering into a film or into a theatre, you can always do it. That will always make a difference. So a little bit of a career counseling also I do with the help of poems.
Very good, very good.
Yeah, that.
Journalism, administration,
Yeah,
civil services.
Yes.
There are so many career
things.
options. English literature doesn't prevent students from pursuing different
I
kind
communicate
of options.
that with the help of Road Not Taken by Robert Frost.
That's good. Yes, ma'am. What are your favorite poems and how do you use them often?
Yeah, there were many which I often go with quoting that, but particularly the poem of Ulysses, which I wanted to, yes, Ulysses, which I want to, like I would like to share the few lines where I could see the sense of purpose in their lives, which I could share with the youngsters. And so, though much is taken, much abides. And particularly I was impressed by this line and also the concluding part of the poem. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. So there has been a very, very, very favorite phrase of me, which I often recite to myself and also to the students. So
That's
that is
great.
it.
That's great. Say, perhaps this question can address the problem of what are the uses of poetry.
But
Poetry has its own moral purpose, but then we have poets, critics saying that poetry may not necessarily serve a specific purpose. We are aware of that dilemma or discussion that is current in our literary circle. Still, as teachers, we have a role to play in the class to guide students with the help of poetry. I hope both of you
but
agree with that.
definitely, so.
Okay.